Now, yesterday, we found out that Steve Jobs would be stepping down as CEO of Apple. In a letter to the Apple community, Jobs wrote, "I've always said if there ever came a day when I could no longer meet my expectations as Apple's CEO, I would be the first to let you know. Unfortunately, that day has come. His battle with pancreatic cancer, as well as other health problems, have long been public. Although at this note, there were no specific details given." Now, immediately we saw Apple shares tumble. Immediately, we've seen questions arise as to what the future of Apple will be. How much does a CEO really matter? Will the company be able to hold on to that second most valuable spot in the world? Well, let's take a moment to reflect on what it is that made Jobs himself stand out. What made some call him the Edison of our time? Is it a rare stroke of genius that can't be repeated? Or is there something that today's business culture could really learn from Jobs to help America innovate and create more jobs? Here to discuss this with me is Derek Thompson, senior editor at The Atlantic. Derek, thanks so much for joining us tonight. Steve Jobs, let's talk about what it is that made him who he is. I mean, do you think that this man really is some kind of a genius, or is it that he also just went with his gut, that he was not afraid to make mistakes, that if he had an idea, he went through it, didn't worry about focus groups, and kept pushing?
I think the evidence is pretty clear. He is the greatest, most important CEO of our generation. And that sounds like a huge sweeping statement, but it might be understating the case. He might be the greatest CEO of the 20th and early 21st centuries. We're talking about a guy who came into his company after a quarter where it lost money. It is now the largest company in the world by market share, on par with Exxon. And then once we heard the news that he was resigning, it lost about $10 to $17 billion, equal to the GDP of some small countries. This is the greatest CEO of our time, and I think what made him that it will be debated, and history will be its own judge. I think what it is it's his austere sense of simplicity. You look at these products, the iPod, the iPad, and they are incredibly simple. And this simplicity extends not just through the products, but also through the showroom-like retail centers where you buy these products, and through the advertisements as well.
That's designing, right? That's Apple's brand.
Absolutely.
You could say.
Right. When I wrote this piece today, calling him the Edison of our time, people said, oh, but Edison invented things and Steve Jobs just took ideas. Edison took ideas too. He didn't invent the light bulb. He didn't invent a lot of the ideas that we consider him being the first to come up with. And Steve Jobs was similarly a genius in taking ideas that existed and perfecting them and marketing them for a mass audience.
He just did it better, you think?
He did. He just did it better.
But, I mean, so is that why you think, why are people willing to pay so much money to buy an Apple product when you can get the exact same thing for cheaper? It just might be, a PC, or it might be a different laptop out there. It might be Dell or something. Why are people willing to pay so much more? Just because it looks good? Well,
yeah, looking good is an important thing, and part of this might be sort of conspicuous branding for yourself. You want people to see you with an iPhone. You want people to see you with an iPad. But beyond that, I think this doesn't sound terribly intellectual, but they just work better. iPhones just work better than a lot of Droids, and the iPad works better than the Playbook from BlackBerry. This is something that critics say again and again. The products just work better, and they work better because they have a vision of simplicity, and there's an ease of use that's associated with everything from the iPod to the iPhone to the iPad.
But do they also work better because Steve Jobs is willing to take certain risks, right? A number of people today decided that, hey, why don't we focus on some of Steve Jobs' failures rather than his successes to find out what kind of a man he really was? And you could talk about the Apple I, the Apple II, which there were only a couple of hundred. They really failed. You can talk about the Lisa. He had to go through a lot of ups and downs first. And I'm just wondering, do you think that in the business environment today, people are more afraid to take those kinds of risks? They're more afraid to fail? Or in Silicon Valley, is that still very much the norm?
Well, in Silicon Valley, there's a culture of failure. It's the kind of place where if you fail starting your first company, it's okay. People actually want to hire you because they say, now that you've learned what it means to fail, we think you'll actually be more successful. I will say this about Steve Jobs. He's been on a run in the last 10 years that is just unprecedented. We're talking about a guy who 10 years ago invents the iPod. It sold 314 million devices. The iPhone itself is only 4 years old. If a child was born on the day the iPhone came out, that child wouldn't yet be in kindergarten, and yet there's an entire economy that revolves around creating apps and devices that basically make the iPhone one of the most important devices of our generation. It's not even 5 years old. He's on an unbelievable run, and it's hard to imagine.
It's scary to think about the fact that it's not even 5 years old. I already feel like it's been around forever. But so in that case, is there anybody else out there that you think could take Steve Jobs' place, or that has similar tactics that he does, that just goes against the grain, like I mentioned before, right? He never did focus groups. I feel like these days, if you go to business school, probably the first thing that you have to learn when it comes to marketing, when it comes to branding, is that you do focus groups. You find out what people want first rather than having an idea, right? Having some kind of spark go off and just charging full speed ahead.
On the one hand, I think it's fair to say that Steve Jobs is sort of one of a kind. On the other hand, without the use of prophecy, I don't know who the next Steve Jobs is going to be. But I think it's inevitable to say there's going to be.
Could we compare, Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook, or are these guys already a different beast?
I think the safest and smartest thing to say right now is that we don't know, but there will be another great CEO who's going to do unbelievable things that we don't know from now. I mean, think about it. This company in 1997 was in a ditch. People thought that Apple was done. Microsoft in the year 2000 was worth $600 billion. It was the most valuable company in the history of the world, and it's had stagnating stock for the last 10 years. We can't predict the future, but I think we do know that at the rate of technological change, there's going to be another person who has as big an impact on our life as Steve Jobs. Maybe it's 2 or 3 people from different companies. It might not be one, but it's going to happen.
But so in that case, do you think that, you mentioned, of course, obviously, we saw shares plummet when it came to Apple. How big of a difference is it going to be without Steve Jobs around for Apple? I mean, they probably already have a lot of products in line for, what, the next 10 years or so?
I don't know what's coming next. They're a famously secretive company. But also, speaking of famously, investors are famously melodramatic, right? Like, you hear that Steve Jobs is leaving the company, you immediately sell off Apple for 10%. The fact is that Apple's price-to-earnings ratio, which is a good way to look at how healthy the stock is going forward, it's actually lower average compared to the rest of the Dow, even though they're quarterly revenue statements are just astronomical. We're looking at a company that still is going to move into China and India as a rising middle class, makes money so that they can buy iPods and iPads and iPhones. I think the future of this company is extremely bright, but predictably, I think another company is probably going to come along and conquer it and conquer Google. We just don't know what it is
I guess,
yet.
we're just going to have to wait and see. It's an exciting world that we live in. But I think that, one of the questions that we also should ask is there are a number of other countries out there that are trying to replicate Silicon Valley. How do we also replicate that across the rest of America? How do you have this culture of failure rather than too big to fail banks, too big to fail auto industry, and get that to come into the rest of our society so we can actually start innovating again? Right.
Well, it's tough. I've actually asked a lot of people, and a lot of columnists for The Atlantic have written about what's the secret of Silicon Valley. And it's tough to put your finger on, but I think one of the pieces is a culture of failure, and a culture that says, entrepreneurs, they grow up, they cash out, they make their millions or billions, and then they say, what we want to do? We want to reach back down into the next generation and help pull them up. It's an incredible culture of collaboration that invites failure and says, it's okay if this project doesn't work.
So
the
Warren
most successful
Buffett should be investing his $5 billion somewhere else, maybe, and not Bank of America right now.
But Buffett has a lot of money in a lot of different pots. So.
All right, Derek, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Now, still to come, we have the do not call list to block telemarketing calls. But does the do not track list online really work? Find out in just a moment. And the FBI's made counterterrorism one of their top priorities since 9/11. But are they